right, tonight's presentation will be given by William Levinson of Levinson Productivity Systems, PC. The topic is reshoring production, how to rebuild manufacturing in the USA using lean manufacturing. Bill Levinson is the owner of Levinson Productivity Systems, PC, which specializes in quality management systems, lean manufacturing, and industrial statistics. He's the author of numerous articles and books on quality, statistics, and management, including the upcoming Reshoring Production, How to Rebuild Manufacturing and Restore High Wages, High Profits, and National Prosperity in the USA. And in lieu of reading the abstract for his presentation for this evening, as I'm sure most of you have done already on my ASQ or in the program announcement that I sent out previously, we will go ahead and get started with the presentation this evening. Bill, I turn the floor over to you. You might be on mute.
Okay, do you see my screen?
I can see your screen, yes.
Okay, I'll switch over to slideshow.
Okay. Yep, perfect. First slide.
Thank you for coming tonight, and I hope you find this useful. An overview of this is we'll start out by showing manufacturing as the foundation of national prosperity and also military power, and the decline in manufacturing capability is a universal leading indicator of a decline in national well-being and influence. There have been no exceptions to this rule as far as I know. Cheap labor is a dysfunctional and dangerous illusion. We were talking about people sending jobs offshore for cheap labor, the idea being that if you can pay somebody less, you can reduce your cost. That certainly sounds logical up front, but it's a dysfunctional and dangerous illusion. Once we get rid of that paradigm, we can move forward for reshoring. The good news, and we were talking about Henry Ford and his contemporaries, is that proven off-the-shelf solutions to the challenge of cheap labor have been available for more than 100 years. Manufacturing is the backbone of military power and national affluence. Absence or decline in manufacturing capability has been a universal leading indicator of national decline. Examples include the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. When we think of Poland today, we don't think it's a very big country, but there was a time when it was one of the biggest and most powerful countries in Eastern Europe. It included not only Poland, but also Lithuania, and Lithuania was much bigger than it is today. Ukraine and Belarus. So it was extremely large and powerful. It was an agricultural power and very powerful militarily. But they noticed even in the 16th century that they were deficient in manufacturing in contrast to some of the other countries in Europe. Spanish and Portuguese empires. Those were supposedly enormously powerful because they found a lot of gold and silver in the New World, and of course, everybody thought that would make them rich and powerful, and it actually did the opposite. It encouraged them to offshore their manufacturing to the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, which actually ruined Spain and Portugal. War of Independence was caused by manufacturing disparities between the colonies and England. The American Civil War was caused partially by disparities in manufacturing capability between the Union and the Confederacy, and once the war started, the Confederacy's cause was essentially hopeless because the Union could outproduce them like 15 or 20 to 1. First World War was won by American manufacturing capability, and also, of course, the Second World War won by American manufacturing capability. So the wisdom of offshoring manufacturing power to other countries is highly questionable, and I think people are starting to realize that. We started with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By the way, in the handouts, everybody should get a PDF copy of the slides and the accompanying notes, and it also gives the references for where these statements are coming from. And it was noted, even in the mid-16th century, that Poland was exporting little other than commodities along with rudimentary finished goods, such as cloth, beer, and rope. They said it was essentially the same kind of trading pattern that places third world countries at the mercy of industrialized nations today. This was cited as early as 1543. At the time, Spain and Portugal were importing all that gold and silver from the New World. Harrington Emerson, and he wrote a rather interesting book in 1911, I believe called The 12 Principles of Efficiency, said the United States, even though we were an industrialized nation, we were still primarily agricultural, and we were exporting natural resources for manufactured goods. And when it says people who trade us sunshine, water, and air, they were talking, for example, about France growing grapes and turning them into wine, essentially taking sunlight, air, and water, making them into grapes, and then making them into wine. And they were talking prices of something like $10 a bottle, and that was in the money of 1911, when $10 was an enormous amount of money. Hernan Cortés and other Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors discovered enormous amounts of gold and silver in Mexico and South America, so everybody thought it would make them the most powerful and affluent nations on earth, and their mistake was to confuse gold and silver with actual value and utility. All that gold and silver are, they're mediums of exchange. They're valuable because they're scarce, so people can use them as money. Also, they do have some value as industrial metals. Gold and silver do have some industrial uses, but their primary use back then was as a medium of exchange. Alfred Thayer Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History shows it was a total illusion. He said that, yes, Spain was the first to occupy large and rich portions of the New World and wasn't even challenged there for a very long time. And they were expected to be foremost among the sea powers, and exactly the opposite happened. Now, they discovered the New World in 1492, and by 1588, their navy was already outclassed by the Royal Navy because the British and the Dutch were both into manufacturing things, and they also had to build large merchant marines to carry all the raw materials that they needed for their industries, whereas Spain could pack a lot of treasure into one galleon, and that made the galleons very attractive targets for pirates. Some of Queen Elizabeth's commanders were essentially privateers who were licensed pirates, and they would prey upon Spanish shipping for that reason. If they captured a galleon, they could get quite a lot of money out of it. Even Lepanto in 1571 was won primarily by some warships from the Venetian arsenal, which was essentially an assembly line for making ships. Venice, very powerful country back then, had essentially an assembly line for making warships and probably merchant ships. And these were technologically superior to whatever it was Spain was using. Mahan continues that Spain stopped manufacturing things and instead had to send money to the Dutch, who didn't get along very well with Spain at the time. So they were sending their money to the Netherlands for manufactured goods because they weren't making anything for themselves. The same thing happened to Portugal, where he says all manufacturers fell into insane contempt, and the Portuguese were buying their clothing and everything else from the British, just like most of the clothing that comes here is imported. Look at where it comes from. It's generally not the United States. Eventually, the Portuguese had to sell everything they had. The British like port wine, and port wine is named for Oporto in Portugal, and those were actually acquired by the United Kingdom in exchange for manufactured goods. A major cause of the American Civil War, South traded cotton to British textile mills in exchange for manufactured goods, while the North's economy was based on manufacturing, and the factory owners in the North argued for protectionist tariffs against the British, for which the southern states traded cotton. So the South was actually worried that the North was going to ruin its economy with these tariffs, and that was a major cause of the Civil War. Also, and we're going to see that Aristotle predicted 2,300 years ago that automation and industrialization would make slavery obsolete. And Britain, the United Kingdom, I believe towards the end of the 18th century or early 19th century, abolished slavery. And since that was really the center of the Industrial Revolution, industrialization played a large role in making that happen. Now, obviously, if slavery can be made uneconomical, low-wage labor can similarly be made economical, and this was predicted by Aristotle about 2,300 years ago. However, once the war began, the South's cause was essentially hopeless because the North could outproduce like 15 or 20 to 1. How most of the world abolished slavery without fighting civil wars, and this is from Aristotle, book by Aristotle written, as I said, 2,300 years ago, that if every instrument would accomplish its own work, chief workmen would not want servants nor masters slaves, or by implication, low-wage labor. Now, the Greeks actually had what we would now call science fiction stories about what we would now call robots. God Hephaestus had a couple of mechanical men in his workshop that he had assisting him, so they could actually envision machines that would do labor. They couldn't build anything like that, of course, so they did build some ingenious machines for saving work, and even showed that steam could do work, but they could at least envision these machines, and Aristotle predicted what would happen when we have those machines, which we certainly have today. The Ford Motor Company's I'm trying to move something off the middle of my screen here. There, okay, that's better. Okay, the Ford Company's Highland Park plant in 1922. Ford's industries made the United States the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth and created the middle class. They were paying $5 a day, which doesn't sound like much, but remember back then the dollars were made out of silver, and you could buy a large loaf of bread for a dime. You could probably buy a week's worth of groceries for 1 hour, for one day's work. Ford achieved this with manufacturing methods that were cited explicitly as countermeasures against cheap offshore labor. Admiral Yamamoto warned Imperial Japan against going to war with the United States because he knew what our industries looked like even in 1940, I guess, or 1940, 1941, when they were planning the Pearl Harbor attack. I believe he said he could have his way in the Pacific for 6 months after a war started, but after that, he didn't think he could win. And if you look at Ford's Willow Run bomber factory, you can see why the Axis didn't have a chance in that war. And it was clear by 1941 that factories, rather than agriculture, were the primary source of wealth and military power. Speaking of agriculture, there was a time that military power was tied very closely to agriculture because the landowners had to defend their land, and also the land gave people the money with which to afford weapons, and ownership of land was once tied very closely to military service, such as the feudal system in the Middle Ages. A knight or a nobleman would have a fief granted by the king, which was a source of income. It was land which was a source of income, and in exchange, the knight or noble owed the king military service. The system was the same in ancient Greece, where the hoplites, the armored infantry of the ancient Greeks, those were mostly farmers who had the money to afford the expensive armor and also a reason, namely defense of their land, to fight to protect their land. And this was true in many, if not most, other countries. Feudal Japan, the samurai were given fiefs of land in exchange for which they owed their lord military service. In the United Kingdom, the landowners would often purchase commissions in the army, and they had a lot of prestige, and they actually looked down on people who didn't own land, such as military engineers, artillerymen. And the Royal Navy didn't allow people to buy commissions either. Those people actually had to know what they were doing, but because they didn't own land, they were looked down upon. It was clear, however, by the early 20th century that land was no longer the primary source of military power. We've seen how manufacturing overtook agriculture as the world's primary source of wealth and military power during the past few hundred years. This was evident more than 200 years ago, more than 200 years prior to the Industrial Revolution, when they had mostly cottage industries, when Spain and Portugal ceded their manufacturing ability to England and Holland. This is the same kind of manufacturing superiority the United States has ceded to other countries, and there's clearly something wrong with this. They're complaining, by the way, that a lot of people are in low-wage jobs. Of course, the federal deficit is something like $32 trillion and counting. There's clearly a connection between that and the loss of our manufacturing capability. Supply chain implications. We've seen a lot of supply chain disruptions due to COVID-19 and natural disasters, and offshoring increases risks. The IATF automotive standard, which corresponds to ISO 9001, but it's more extensive. And by the way, I would recommend getting this and reading it. It's expensive, but it has stuff in there that's not in ISO 9001, but it's nonetheless extremely useful regardless of whether you're in automotive. In this case, they have a clause that requires contingency plans, continuity of supply in the event of force majeure, such as natural disasters or labor shortages. Remember, if you can't get what you need to run your factory, it doesn't matter how good your factory is. If you can't get the raw materials necessary to run it. The references for these are given in the handout. There was an earthquake that knocked out global silicon wafer production. You can't make semiconductors without silicon wafers. APIX, that's now ASCM, the Association for Supply Chain Management, said 85% of companies reported supply chain disruptions. There was a fire in 1993 which put more than half of the world's supply of a critical epoxy resin at risk. So there's supply chain. When you send things offshore, we're also increasing the risk of supply chain interruptions. Next, answer to cheap labor. And the first step is to get rid of the dysfunctional paradigm that cheap labor reduces costs. Cheap labor actually gives massive inefficiencies a place to hide because there's no real incentive to do anything about it. In fact, Emerson remarked that the Suez Canal was built with, it wasn't exactly slave labor, it was more like robot or corvée, which is a tax paid in the form of labor. And he said there were people who were actually digging with their hands to build the Suez Canal, and it finished, I think, about 5 years late. And, well, I think one of the next slides covers it, but substantially over budget. That was with essentially free labor, and they would have been better off using power equipment, which they eventually did. This actually came up, and this is from Emerson's book, The 12 Principles of Efficiencies. And this whole thing apparently started during the war between Prussia and Austria, and later Prussia versus France, where Helmuth von Moltke, who was leading the Prussian army at the time, was actually at a disadvantage because Prussia had fewer men. Prussia didn't have as much money as France. It wasn't as industrialized as France. The Prussian rifle was even inferior to the French rifle at the time. So he couldn't meet the French head-on and expect to win. He realized that the struggle before it began was to be one of efficiency versus inefficiency, which is essentially how Prussia won the Franco-Prussian War, despite having less soldiers, an inferior rifle, less money, less equipment, and so on. Now, apparently the Japanese were modernizing at the time. Admiral Perry had opened Japan to trade with the West in the mid-1850s, and the Japanese, they were still essentially a feudal society because they had closed the country off to foreign influences, and they realized that they had better do something to modernize before they got taken over, and they did. It took them, 40 years later, they had won the war against China, which was 10 times their size in terms of people. And in 1905, they won the war against Russia. And that was, 1905, that would be about 50 years after Admiral Perry went there. So there were people in Japan who remembered samurai going around, and the samurai were in charge of anything, and then by 1905, they had just won the war against a major European power, and the Japanese had adopted, apparently, Moltke's principles of efficiency versus inefficiency, and that's what they used. Emerson adds that they resist the demand for a 10% increase in wages, but tolerate a 50% inefficiency in the worker. This is why cheap labor is a dysfunctional illusion. And he gives another example that relates to opportunity costs or results not achieved due to failure to use the best available method. The United States was not only afraid of cheap labor in the early 20th century, we were terrified of efficient foreign labor in the 20th century. This is what I was talking about a moment ago, where the Japanese put Moltke's principles into effect and applied them to their industries as well as to their armed forces. In other words, they took Moltke's military principles and realized they could do the same thing with their industries. I mentioned that they had defeated an opponent 10 times their size in the Sino-Japanese War. Then they defeated Russia, and that was only after about 50 years after they began to westernize their country. Then Emerson says, as soon as the Russo-Japanese War was over, we were terrified of the industrial organization of Japan, and we realized we had to do something about it. So it wasn't just the Japanese in the 1970s sending Toyotas over here, and the automotive industry finally realized they had to do something about that. But even as early as 1905, we realized that the Japanese were on to something and that we had better learn from it, or we would be at a disadvantage to them in terms of industrial competition. He said that he pointed out Japan doesn't have much in the way of natural resources. They really don't have that many people. They don't have too much in the way of natural resources. But he said the United States, were dragging along under a type of organization that makes high efficiency impossible. They are not. In other words, they have an efficient organization, and we did not. Emerson and his contemporaries, however, overcame this challenge, and we can use the same principles today. Another question, and this has come up with all this controversy over AI, they're saying, oh, the AI is going to take our jobs away. Well, they've been saying that machines were going to take people's jobs away for more than 2,000 years. Well, when Aristotle said machinery would eventually make slavery obsolete, the people back then thought slavery was normal, and they were afraid of something that would end slavery. Then the Industrial Revolution, when they came up with automated weaving machines in the United Kingdom, they had people called Luddites who smashed the machines because they were afraid it was going to take their jobs away, when in fact weaving machinery is why. Well, back then, if you had one or two sets of clothing, that was probably all you had. And the weavers didn't get paid all that much because they were doing it by hand. Well, now, of course, we have closets full of clothing we never use. People who make the clothing get paid very good wages. So now they're saying the same thing. Well, the AI is going to take people's jobs away. The robots are going to take people's jobs away. Well, Thomas Edison foresaw what would happen when this came to pass, that manufacturers can then afford to pay any kind of wages, and I believe he also projected that instead of having a 40-hour work week, we might have a work day or even a half work day. In other words, every week we would work one day, and that would produce enough value to create a very high standard of living once automation gets to this stage. And we've already seen progression in that direction, because there was a time we didn't have a 40-hour work week. The work week was, I believe, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And Henry Ford's method allowed reduction of the work week to 5 days of 8 hours, and I think some places are now going to 4-day work weeks. So I don't see any downside to this. Cheap labor does not symbolize low wage prices and high profits. It's symptomatic of high prices and low profits, which seems counterintuitively, but we'll see why in a moment. Cheap labor gives inefficiency a place to hide. Popular wisdom, or it is known, management views the $100 paid by the customer as shown here. Let's say $100 comes in, you pay $90 in wages, make $10 in profit. And they say, well, if we ship the jobs offshore and pay the workers only $20 and make $50 in profit, we can reduce our price to $70. This is what they were getting at when they offshored jobs to other countries for cheap labor. Now we look at the real situation where the customer is paying $100 and the real wages are only $10, and maybe $80 of that is waste, and 80 is not an exaggeration. Ford said that some jobs, including in agriculture, can contain 95% waste that's built into the job. So we can have our $70 price again, pay our workers much higher wages, and also make much higher profits by getting rid of the waste. But if we go offshore for cheap labor, the waste is still there. We've just hidden it behind cheap labor. Ford said of this, Ford didn't think much of people who cut wages or by implication shipped jobs offshore for cheap labor. He said to overcome by management what other people try to overcome by wage reduction, which is essentially a restatement of what Emerson said, a battle between efficiency and inefficiency, overcome by management what other people overcome by wage reduction. Suppose you run a construction firm in 1910 or so, your customers are unhappy that they have to pay 75 cents for every 125 bricks. The workers, meanwhile, will get only 50 cents per hour. I'm talking about the money of the early 20th century. So we can't really ship those jobs offshore. We mentioned that someone had a construction example for solar panels. Bricklayers could lay 125 bricks per hour under these conditions. Anyone see what's wrong with this job? Now, the instant anybody who has read anything by Henry Ford or Frank Gilbreth would see that the instant that worker bends over to pick up a brick, that's waste motion. Gilbreth's non-stooping scaffold increased the productivity to 350 per hour, and with less effort, now the workers get less money per brick, but because they lay 350 rather than the 125 an hour, they actually make a lot more per hour. The employer takes less profit per brick, but again, you're laying 350 versus 125 per hour, so the employer is making more profit per hour, and in the meantime, the customer is paying less, so everybody is a lot happier. Many, if not most, jobs contain enormous waste, and when we remove the waste, we have higher wages and lower prices. Aichi Ono said in 1937, one American was as productive as 3 Germans, and 1 German as productive as 3 Japanese, and that's not because our people were any smarter. Germany and Japan had excellent education systems, what we now call science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but they didn't have our efficiency systems. They weren't cheap labor, they were skilled labor, but their jobs were not designed efficiently. Frederick Winslow Taylor said that what differentiates wealthy countries from poor ones is the average worker in one is 5 or 6 times as productive as the other. We've already seen that a badly designed job can waste 64% of a worker's labor, and low-wage labor gives the waste a place to hide. Next is opportunity cost, which can far exceed inefficiency. Henry Ford, this is why My Life and Work is such a good book, because he comes up with concepts like these. Says that the absence of a device that saves 10% is always a 10% tax. The opportunity cost is the unrealized revenue or savings from what we fail to do, so the opportunity cost is 10%. Opportunity costs, by the way, are not recognized by the cost accounting system. We can't write off money we don't make tax deduction. The references for these are given in the handout. There was an online article that says people are employed in low-wage jobs, and they have a video that goes with the article, and if you watch the video, it tells you in a fraction of a second why those jobs pay so badly. The worker is using a mop to clean the floor of a large warehouse or factory. Of course, I looked up automatic commercial floor cleaners, and I found what I expected to find, namely that there were automated riding cleaners that don't cost much and can do, well, what's 60,000 divided by 5,000, can do the work of 12 people with mops. Actually, I saw something in Sam's Club a while ago where this machine was moving around cleaning the floor, and it had a place to ride in the steering wheel, but nobody was in it. And I thought, boy, did this thing get loose? Maybe there's an emergency off switch I better press, because there was a place for somebody to ride, but nobody was in it. But then I looked closer, and it had some sort of device attached to it, and when someone stepped in front of it, it would stop or turn aside, and I realized that it didn't even need a person to run it. So obviously whoever maintains that machine gets paid a lot more per hour than somebody with a mop, and the job, needless to say, costs a lot less. Median hourly wage for janitors is, well, it's better than minimum wage, but it's not a middle class wage. So obviously, if we pay 12 people this amount to clean 60,000 square feet, it costs us $171, $72 an hour plus benefits and employment taxes, or we can pay one person $20 or more to use the machine to clean 60,000 square feet an hour. And if we assume we spend $5 an hour to pay for the machine itself, we're going to be a lot better off. So if we're using mops, here's what the customer is paying to have the floor cleaned. Not cleaned due to absence of the machine is in red. Cost is about $2.86 per 1,000 square feet. Use the machine costs us 42 cents per 1,000 square feet, even though the worker is making more money to do the job. An opportunity cost is not the cost of what we do wrong, but rather the cost of what we fail to do right. Opportunity costs are invisible to the cost accounting system, and cheap labor gives opportunity costs ample place to hide. They still pick cotton by hand in Uzbekistan, even though they have machines that have been available for decades. We were talking about younger people, getting younger people involved in this. Student Action with Farm Workers complains about how little people get paid to harvest sweet potatoes, and apparently they can be paid less than minimum wage. If you look at a YouTube video of sweet potato harvesting, it shows people bending over to pick them and then carrying buckets around. So if you're familiar with Henry Ford's principles, you can look at that, realize in less than a second what's wrong with that job. There are of course, machines that do that. People get paid more and the job costs less. So the opportunity cost of not using the machine is reflected in low wages for workers, high prices for buyers, and mediocre profits for the employers. We were talking about strawberry picking earlier. California Rural Legal Assistance is complaining about the grueling work, and of course it doesn't pay very much. They have automated strawberry picking machines, and I mentioned the trailers where the workers ride face down. Cotton picking talks about how it's hard back-breaking work. Yeah, if you're dragging a bag of cotton around that weighs up to 70 pounds, that's certainly a lot of labor that doesn't really go into actually harvesting cotton. And at the time, they had a machine that could pick cotton 50 times as quickly. That was John Rust's original cotton harvester. Now they have John Deere and international harvesting machines that do the work of 1,000 hand laborers. They're still using a robot or corvée, essentially a labor tax in Uzbekistan, where they have a mandatory 20-kilogram daily quota of cotton. There's an Indian-made handheld rechargeable battery-powered cotton picking machine. It looks like something you get in a home improvement store like Lowe's or Home Depot, except it picks cotton, costs less than $100, and does as much work as 6 people doing it by hand in Uzbekistan. So this reinforces the fact that low wages are often symptomatic of low rather than high profits and high rather than low prices. Now, they might argue in Uzbekistan that this is essentially a labor tax, so the labor is free, but remember, they still have to feed and house the workers, even if they're not actually paying the money. So even the cost of subsistence would exceed that of a moderately well-paid Indian worker using this machine to pick cotton. Japanese workers increased production of protective gowns for COVID-19 using primarily items purchased from a 100-yen store. The video is no longer online. It was from Toyota Times. It's very, very instructive. People come up with extremely innovative ways to make people more productive. Someone didn't have a seed drill, so a woman walked in high-heeled shoes to make holes for seeds. Yes, that is Jethro Tull. The English rock group is actually named for this British inventor of the 18th century. There was an inventor called Jethro Tull, and for some reason Ian Anderson named his group after Jethro Tull. Harvesting fruit. If you see people climbing ladders to harvest fruit, take one look at that. You say, why are people climbing ladders? That's waste motion. And somebody came up, they cut a plastic bottle to make a scoop with which to sever the fruit, and they attached a cloth chute to deliver the fruit to the worker. Saved a lot of labor. I think you can buy things like that for about $20. You have fruit you want to harvest. We're talking about don't assume the job is being done the best way. Obviously, the job is not being done the best way. Remember, I mentioned subsistence. So the Uzbekistan workers performing feudal robot that was a tax in the form of labor. It's where the word for a mechanical worker comes from. Or even if you have 6 slaves, you still have to feed them and put a roof over their head, even if you're not paying them. So without the machine could easily be more expensive than one paid worker with the machine, which is exactly why automation made slavery obsolete, and also by implication low-wage labor. This is how we make American labor more than competitive with cheap offshore labor. So in summary, opportunity costs are invisible to the cost accounting system because we can't write them off as losses on our tax returns. And however cheap labor gives waste a place to hide, access to cheap labor simply covers up the waste instead of getting rid of it. Ford and other American industrialists proved repeatedly that cheap offshore labor cannot compete with high-wage American labor if management and labor put brains into the business. So we've seen so far actionable information to rebuild the manufacturing and ensure we can safely ignore threats to disrupt our supply chain. And none of this is in theory. We did it before and we can do it again. We did it in 1908 when Ford introduced the Model T. Prior to that, automobiles were luxury items. Only wealthy people could afford them. Ford made it so almost everybody could afford them. We did it again during the Second World War. This is also worth reading by Victor Davis Hanson, talked about our reaction to the First World War. We were in pretty bad shape in the late 1930s because of the Great Depression. As of 1944, our gross domestic product exceeded that not only of the enemy, but also our allies, such as the United Kingdom. In other words, our gross domestic product exceeded that of all the other belligerents in the war. Human losses could, of course, not be replaced, but material losses could be. The Sherman tank had a bad reputation of lighting up every time it was hit by one of the German tanks. The Germans actually had better tanks. The armor was pretty much invulnerable from the front to the Sherman tank's guns, so that the Sherman had to get around the German tank's side in order to destroy it. The difference being, though, if the Sherman was destroyed and the crew got out alive, they were simply issued another tank because we could make them faster than the enemy could destroy them. On the other hand, if we destroyed a Tiger tank, those were not mass-produced, so there probably was not another tank available to replace the lost Tiger. We lost several aircraft carriers during the war, but we had more at the end of the war than when we started. Most of that was in the war in the Pacific. I believe the Japanese may have completed 2 or 3 aircraft carriers during the war, and they converted a couple of battleships into aircraft carriers. But they really couldn't replace their losses, and we could. And that's what Admiral Yamamoto was warned about when the war started. Says we have reserves of natural gas, so we don't have to depend on hostile foreign nations for energy. We developed substitutes for raw materials whose supply was cut off by the Axis. We also have a legacy of innovation. And remember, the Toyota production system was invented here. It wasn't invented in Japan, although Taiichi Ono certainly adopted it and probably improved on it. That was invented here. We have a legacy of industrial and manufacturing innovation. Benjamin Franklin may well be the real father of lean manufacturing, where he said if you essentially avoid waste and you're making money. He said wasted time can never be recovered, which is the principle behind Goldratt's theory of constraints. And Henry Ford cited Franklin's influence explicitly. So what we're really dealing with is something not that's merely 100 years old. If we date it back to Henry Ford's My Life and Work in 1922, a little more than 100 years, we're looking at something closer to 250 years old that came from one of our country's greatest inventors. Franklin says, think of saving as well as getting. So, for example, eliminating $1 in waste could be as profitable as another $10 or so in sales. Beware of little expenses. If we apply it more than 100 years later by Henry Ford's factories, is seemingly minor inefficiencies, such as having to walk or look for tools for parts, add up to a lot of waste, and the frontline workers are in the best position to notice these wastes. So a key takeaway from this presentation is have your workers look for anything that seems to be a continuous annoyance or a continuous inefficiency, because it's probably costing you a lot of money. Buy what you don't need, and ere long you shall sell your necessaries. That applies, for example, purchasing departments that get rated on cost per item when they buy things, so they buy huge quantities for which there's no immediate use because they're getting what they think is a good bargain on it. We know that inventory is one of the 7 wastes, and Ford said he wasn't going to do that. They were going to buy things only as they were needed. Okay, the fundamental principles of what we now call lean manufacturing were developed in the United States, and their foundation dates back to the 18th century, straight from Benjamin Franklin. They were developed further in the early 20th century as a specific response not just to cheap offshore labor, but also highly efficient offshore labor. These principles are easy to understand. Ford wrote his books to his era's prevailing secondary school reading and comprehension levels, extremely easy to read and understand. Technology has certainly changed during the past 100 years, but the principles have not, and nothing other than the dysfunctional paradigm that cheap labor equals low prices and high profits prevents us from using them again. Okay, overall summary, manufacturing is the foundation, national affluence and military power. The absence or loss of manufacturing capability played a central role in the decline of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was once the most powerful nation in Europe. In 1683, the Polish army stopped the Ottoman Empire in the very famous Battle of Vienna in 1683, but by 1683, the country was already declining, even though it was at the height of its military power, because manufacturing had gone, I think by then France was also a growing industrial power, as well as many of the countries in what now make up Germany. Decline of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, the secession of the 13 colonies. One story I read was that George Washington, who I think was a planter, got some poor quality manufactured goods from the United Kingdom. And I guess the United Kingdom sold poor quality to the wrong guy, because Washington didn't like it very much and made his displeasure known shortly afterwards. Manufacturing disparity helped cause secession of the Confederacy, although once that happened, the South really didn't have a chance, because the North could outproduce it like 15 or 20 times, 20 to 1. Defeat of the Central Powers in the First World War, and also defeat of the Axis in the Second World War. The United States has exhibited dangerous economic behavior very similar to those cited earlier. We've offshored manufacturing capability. There are stories of ships loaded with scrap iron heading west across the Pacific Ocean to be made into steel, and steel goods to be shipped back to the United States. Immediate danger sign. They say in Australia that they're cutting down forests that were meant to be used by Australians and just shipping the logs over to Asia to be turned into finished goods. They're saying that that's not what our people planted these forests for. Those were for us to use, and not to just export timber. So these are all danger signs, and it needs to be reversed. Cheap labor is often symptomatic of overpriced goods and low profits. Cheap labor is a substitute, what Ford called putting brains into the business. and it gives waste and inefficiency a place to hide. High wages are an incentive to make the jobs more productive. One thing Ford did was he said that if productivity increased, the gains were shared with the workforce. So as soon as the workforce realized that, they played a major role in getting rid of the waste because they knew they would see the benefits. I gave the example of hand picking of crops, one example of how enormous waste can hide behind low-wage labor. Made in America techniques to remove the waste have been around for more than 100 years. Nothing stops us from using them again. Can't overlook opportunity costs. These can be tenfold, 20-fold, or even more, but they cannot be reflected by the cost accounting system. And I gave a couple of examples that underscore this takeaway. Gained manufacturing supremacy twice, and we can and must do it again. Same goal, if we work at it, should be achievable by 2025, if not sooner. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Bill, for your presentation and for all of your insights on bringing manufacturing back on shore using lean principles. I really appreciate you taking the time to make your presentation to us tonight. At this point, we are opening the floor for any questions or comments from our audience, and we do encourage you to chime in with anything that you have for Bill or any questions that you might have regarding his presentation.
I stopped sharing so I can see the chats.
Okay, perfect. Do we have any questions from the floor? From those in attendance this evening? Oh.
Yeah, I have one question, Bill. So it's very interesting, right? How you show that cheap labor often translates to high prices and low profits. But once you go to automation, the total labor requirement also is reduced, correct?
That's correct. If you automate, you're going to reduce the overall costs. However, if the concern is that, okay, our competitor overseas automates and we automate, at that point, they still have to ship whatever they're making across an ocean, and that costs money just for shipping, and it also ties up inventory during transit. So the distance barrier is going to be there. So if we both have the same machines, they're going to be at a disadvantage if they have to ship their goods over here. Now, of course, we're going to be at the same disadvantage if we want to ship goods to them because of the cost of transportation. But automation, even if our competitors do it, should not stop us from reshoring the job, if that's what you're getting at.
Okay, no, my question was more like automation will reduce the overall labor pool, right? Whether it's at the competition or in the US.
Saying automation is going to reduce labor costs. Yeah, it certainly reduces labor costs for both us and for our competitors. If I understand what you're asking correctly.
Okay.
Do I understand what you're asking?
Yeah, my question was more like, the total number of employees will be reduced once you have full automation and eliminate all the waste.
Or are you saying will it reduce the number of employees? It might reduce the number of people needed to do the job. That's what the Luddites were afraid of, that once you had automation, you would fire everybody and people would be out of work. As far as I know, that has not happened, because even though one person can make 10 or 20 times as much, you're also reducing the prices, which increases the demand. So even though people are 10, 20 times as productive, there's also more demand for what they're making because people can afford it. I mentioned that well, like in the 18th century, the ordinary people could only afford 1 or 2 sets of clothing, and they were lucky if they had 1 pair of shoes. Then when they automated that, well, most of us have closets full of shoes that we haven't worn for a while. We have closets full of clothing, and that was go back 200 years, and maybe if you were a king or a duke, you might have closets full of clothing. But if you were an ordinary person, you only had 1 or 2 items of clothing. So the answer is that even though the people who make the clothing are far more productive, there's more demand for it, so they remain employed. I believe automotive employment actually went up when Ford introduced mass production, because there was a time only the rich people could afford automobiles.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bill, we had a question in the chat about where folks can hear more of your presentations. Will you be presenting again anytime soon somewhere that we can either log in if it's online or attend in person if you'll be attending at a conference or if you'll be presenting at a conference?
I might be doing something for my local section 209 in the June time frame. I think we're trying to line somebody else up for May. I'm debating whether I'm going to put something in for BossCon. That's the Boston presentation. That's live. That's not online, so that's not something you would. It's on the other end of the country. The other end of the country from you. That might not be the best.
Gotcha. Well,
I don't know. If you think it might be good for the LSS conference in Phoenix, I might consider that. That's a long trip for me. You're on the other end of the country from me, though.
True. If you're looking for something to do, though, as the weather out here gets cooler and it gets actually kind of nice in Phoenix, it might be an option for you, especially with the...
February is a very good time to be in, definitely a good time to be in Phoenix.
Yes. Yep, absolutely.
Yes,
So
combine a trip to Phoenix with a presentation.
Yep. Exactly.
Not so good a time to be in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. We shovel snow around here. Do you even have that experience in Phoenix, having to shovel snow?
No.
No, it doesn't snow enough in Phoenix for us to have to shovel it. Although I will mention that it has dust, like it has dusted snow here a day or two in the past couple of years. It doesn't stick here though.
I imagine it wouldn't stick around there. We have to shovel here and we have to drive through it.
Yes. Yep. I had more of an observation with some of the examples that you were giving, the bricklaying and the bending over, and then the picking strawberries and the picking sweet potatoes and all of the body mechanics that are involved with that. Your example specifically mentioned the amount of time that it takes to bend over or to pick those strawberries in certain positions. But I was also thinking about the cost of, I guess, bills for like health reasons down the road. So like if you have issues with your back down the road because of the way that you're moving in your job, those costs can come in too. So if you can eliminate those movements, you're actually saving money down the road and not just up front for your business as well in health insurance.
Oh, absolutely. From an ergonomic standpoint, back injuries, or you have people moving things. Even now they have warehouse jobs, they say, required to lift 50 pounds. Well, you lift 50 pounds a few times if you lift properly with your legs. I know you can get hurt if you don't lift properly with your legs. Plus, and Henry Ford told us this more than 100 years ago, that anytime you need to apply physical force to something, that's a job for a machine and not for a person. Oh, sure. Also, of course, bending over, it's arduous, it's exhausting, and it adds absolutely no value to the job. I saw a video on YouTube of someone, roofers, they were carrying big bundles of roof tiles up a ladder. I think those can weigh 50 or 60 pounds.
Mhm.
And I would question the safety of that. That's not formal engineering advice. I'm not a safety engineer, but OSHA does have fall protection requirements, and someone's going up a ladder with something that weighs 60 pounds. I would question the safety of that. Plus, of course, that adds no value to the job, and they have mechanical conveyors, obviously, for getting things up on top of roofs.
Yep.
But these people, for whatever reason, were not using them.
Hmm.
But they say, well, the job gets done. We're not going to question it. And that's exactly what we have to do, is to question how the job gets done.
Right. Right. Does anyone else have questions for Bill this evening?
I just wanted to say thank you for the reading list. I appreciate all the book citations.
I hope my information was useful to you.
Oh, absolutely.
I think what we learned this evening is beneficial to a variety of industries. I know that in government, I can apply what you presented this evening to many different facets of my job. So it's not just manufacturing specific. It can be applied to most everything else as well.
Oh, it definitely can be applied to services. I remember someone set up a buffet, and they had a long line backed up because they had one end of the table against the wall. Normally, you put the table out so people can go around both sides. They didn't even think to do that. That's just one type of service industry. Healthcare, Henry Ford designed a hospital to minimize the amount of walking that nurses had to do, with the result that the healthcare cost less and the nurses could be paid more. Yeah, sure, you can use these principles in any industry.
Yep. Agreed. All right. Oh, did I hear someone with a question?
Hillary, can I just follow up on what Bill just said?
Yes, absolutely.
So Bill, especially you mentioned in healthcare with the nurse movement. So I know I've done a lot of spaghetti diagrams with my teams to show the wasted their motion. And I'm always surprised when I come back and I'm like, okay, we can take away some of these, especially they complain about no bathroom breaks or lunch breaks. And I'm always surprised when we try to make it efficient. Again, it's kind of disrupting their usual flow. To get them deconditioned of how they've been doing things has always been a challenge, even though there is a benefit for them. So what suggestions do you have with, even when you show the reduction in the waste with an outcome, a benefit for them, how do you get them to, I guess, accept that and move away from their traditional means?
You're saying that they resist efforts to
make the
improve
change. Yeah.
They don't understand that if they don't have the waste motion, then they can have breaks and won't be as tired at the end of the day.
And it could be my messaging, but even though I have said, showed them we can save an hour and a half each day based on the arrangement of the equipment, the workflow, they're always just in this kind of fright mode. No, don't move how things are, It's really amazing.
Well, one thing they have a right to expect is probably they get a little more pay, because if they can save an hour and a half, and well, let's say they take half an hour of that and put it into breaks that they would have otherwise not had, then they should get additional pay as well, because they're adding more value. That's something else important. I mentioned the Luddites were afraid that the machines were going to take their jobs away. A mistake some people make in the lean manufacturing venture is they lay people off. The instant they do that, it's all over for your lean manufacturing initiative.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, that's what happened to the Ford Motor Company in the 1930s when they had all those labor troubles. Henry Ford apparently had a no layoff rule, but his successors didn't follow it. Frederick Taylor warned that if you cut the piece rates in response to a productivity improvement so you don't have to pay the workers more, they're going to say, why should we do this? The employer is just going to keep all the benefits. So if these nurses realize they can save an hour and a half a day, they have to get a share of that in order to get buy-in. I wonder if that's why they resisting a change.
I think it's more along the lines of, have you asked them about rearranging things and they take ownership of it? That's
That
where
was
you,
certainly when
that's where you get the most success out of lean initiatives, is when the operators or whoever it may be, when their input is taken into account and they take ownership of it. And the practitioner, expert, whatever the hell you want to call it, provides that support and resources for them to do what needs to be done.
absolutely. As a matter of fact, the people who actually do the job are probably in the best position to recognize and remove waste, perhaps better in the better position than somebody who comes in from the outside and tries to tell them what to do. Absolutely. That also helps buy-in for the change. People are much less resistant to change when they do it themselves rather than when somebody tells them what to do. Maybe the efficiency expert's role is to point out, well, here's some wasted motion, here's how you're wasting motion, and then once the workers realize that, they'll say, yeah, we're wasting this motion, we're also wasting motion over there, so let's get together and do something about it.
Or you're better off going one step further and ask why they do it that way, finding out the reasons and what you can do to accommodate them doing it the better way. Yeah, I've been doing this for like 35 years.
There's an example from a fabric folding operation in 1911 where it said the workers took 2 steps in one direction to get the material, then they folded it, then they took 2 steps in the other direction to place it in the, I guess, outgoing pile or whatever. And the description said that they had always done it that way. They had never thought to question it. Then when they just moved the workstations closer together to eliminate the need to walk, they were doing twice as much per hour and with less effort.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. There was a presentation at the World Conference this week on one of the examples used was manufacturing paper airplanes, and they said that the factory, and I use air quotes because it was just a mock setup for instructional purposes, but that when the factory was set up correctly and they didn't have people shuttling the airplanes from station to station to station, and they set up the factory in a linear formation, they were actually more efficient than they were when they had all of this extra movement involved with the shuttling of planes from station to station as they were making the different folds. So it's great advice and great feedback for sure.
That's where the work cell came from. Well, first they have the assembly line where instead of the workers having to move the work or move to the work moved to the people.
Mm-hmm.
The work cell improved on that. That was also from Henry Ford. And the idea was, well, if they could have a assembly line for making these paper airplanes, it would be the same concept. Maybe you could simulate that by passing them from one person to the person next to them instead of having to walk to get them. I guess that would sort of simulate what an assembly line does.
Correct, yes, and that's what the instructor was saying, that after each fold that they would move them to a different location in the factory for the next fold, which essentially is how some manufacturing is done, instead of that linear motion or that linear movement, which became more effective and more efficient once they figured out that that's how it should be done.
The farm layout is where you have all the drill presses in one place and the punches in another place and heat treatment in another place.
Yes.
And, well, you have the spaghetti diagram and you're going all over the place to move the work from one place to the next. But if you put everything in line, and Ford put his heat treatment in line with the other steps of the process, the work stays in the same place. It just moves along the assembly line and has different things done to it. Yeah, so you eliminate all that work and all that transportation.
Yep, exactly. All right, well, that puts us at about the 8 o'clock hour. I once again want to thank you, Bill, for coming to talk to us on such short notice tonight. We really appreciate you having availability and the willingness to be present. Your conversation has been extremely enlightening, and I'm sure we can, like I said before, we can all apply what we've learned tonight to various aspects of our jobs in the differing industries that we're in. You're welcome to stay on the line with us while we go over some additional announcements, or you can drop off. It's totally up to you. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, let me circle back to our presentation for this evening. Announcements. Whoops. Okay. Following the meeting this evening, you will be receiving an event satisfaction survey. This will be coming to your email inbox within the next few days. It will also include your electronic recertification unit certificate as part of the thank you email coming from our VOC chair. And actually, I am standing in for our VOC chair this month, so please anticipate an email from me, Hillary Werner, in the next few days. Our 2023 program schedule, the senior leadership team is considering 8 hybrid in-person and virtual meetings. So similar to what you've experienced tonight, 2 per quarter with a guest speaker. We would like to have, it's our goal to have 4 in-person meetings, also including a virtual option. So this slide is actually incorrect. 4 in-person meetings with a virtual option and a guest speaker, so 1 per quarter. And then we'd also like to schedule at least 1 tour within the calendar year, which I am working on for the summer months. We're either looking at touring a company, a winery, a brewery, or getting involved with an organization like Habitat for Humanity or Feed My Starving Children. And this, of course, would be in person only to enhance the networking experience. And then, as usual, we'll have 1 annual holiday networking event, and this will be held in December. And I hope that you'll join us for our upcoming meeting on June 8th. At this point, our speaker is to be determined. We're trying to have this as an in-person hybrid meeting. So if we are able to pull it off, that information will come to you in your email regarding the program. You can find the ASQ Phoenix section on social media on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. If you are on any of these platforms, please find the Phoenix section and like us or follow us for additional information on things going on. Before we disband for this evening, are there any final thoughts, comments, or questions for myself or any members of the Phoenix section?
one final note I would like to add, Hillary. Hi,
Yeah,
this is Bob
absolutely.
Mitchell. Is this past week, actually on Sunday, there was at the WCQI in Philadelphia, there was a member leader day for member leaders of all the ASQ member units, divisions, forums, committees, and sections, where one of the agenda items was to recognize those member units that had participated in the ASQ Performance Excellence Program. So it's similar to a Baldrige type of recognition for performance excellence on behalf of the various member units. And I just like to report that the Phoenix section has won the silver level recognition again. So on behalf of all of the leadership team of the Phoenix section, I want to thank for all your active participation and engagement. And I hope that our members see that in the products and services that we offer. And again, our whole purpose, our mission is to develop a community of practice. So everything we do is geared toward that end. And if there are any other section member perceived benefits you would like us to consider, or to do better than, or more of, or maybe less of, please send us some communication and we will respond as best as we can. But I want to thank, again, the leadership team and our members for achieving this very high distinction within all of ASQ, really. There were just, I think, 6 sections out of 231 that achieved the silver status. So good work by everybody involved.
Yep, and I'll just add to that. The PEP awards are not considered for those sections that are meeting expectations. They are granted to those sections that are exceeding expectations that are set by ASQ. So to know that our section is exceeding expectations is pretty special. So thank you, Bob, for all the work you did last year as chair and for submitting the documentation for that award, because I know that there's a lot of work and effort that goes into it. So everything that you did is very important to that as well.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. That concludes the monthly meeting for the Phoenix section. Until we see you next time, be safe and stay healthy. We will see you all next month. Have a wonderful month of May.